Hi, I'm Carly with Bookish Pixie Reads. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to be covering my September wrap-up. So this month, I felt like it was not a great month for me because I got stuck in the mire of a bunch of books, or like 2 books. And so I didn't read a ton of physical, and a bunch of the audiobooks I listened to were pretty much mostly listened to in the months prior, and I only just finished them in October, so it's counted, so it felt like a sad month for me. And I enjoyed books, and I enjoyed some books better than I enjoyed other books, but I didn't have anything that like I outstandingly loved, and I didn't have anything I hated either. But so for my statistics of what I read this month, I read 9 books, 4 physical, 5 in audio. I had 1 book that I DNF'd, and 1 book is pending DNF, we're considering. I read 9 books by 10 authors, 6 men, 4 women, and 2 identify as LGBT+. And my racial ethnicity reading diversity rates are 8 white, 1 Asian, 1 black, and 2 are Jewish. So probably one of my favorite books that I read this month was Séance Tea Party by Reimena. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but the author's name is Reimena. This is middle grade. It's a graphic novel. Illustrations fully illustrated throughout. It's perfect for spooky season, and it's perfect for if you have a kid who's struggling with maybe their friends, like who's not, I hate saying maturing fast enough or whatnot, because everybody matures at their own rates. There's no like set limit there, but the kids who are moving on to things that they're not ready for yet and are feeling left behind by their friend group, because that's the way I was when I was growing up, and I really felt this book by the time I finished it, which is interesting because when I picked it up, it was really just, I saw it at the library, thought it looked cool, and so I grabbed it. And when I first started reading it when I got home, I struggled with it and ended up putting it down for probably a couple of months. I just kept rechecking it out. And finally it came up to the point where I could no longer do that. And I had one day to read it. And I was like, it's a graphic novel. I can bust that out in a couple of hours. So I did, and I wound up really liking it. But I think where my struggle lay was in the illustrations in the beginning. Our main character, Laura, she's a 12-year-old girl, and she's illustrated as such, and then a few frames later, I almost wasn't sure it was her. Like, I think it was showing like flashback scenes, so she's wearing different clothes, and sometimes her face looked older and her friends looked older even though they weren't, so I wasn't sure like how old she was, and I just kind of struggled following it. It's kind of my issue with graphic novels, is sometimes the illustrations, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be getting from them and what order to go in, which that's not really an issue here, the order, but I struggled a little bit in the beginning. But once I like sat down with it and buckled down, that came together. I didn't have any more struggles with that, but the story really touched me. So Laura, she's our main character. Laura. She's 12, she's going on 13, her birthday's on Halloween. She still plays with her stuffed animals, has imaginary games with them, but all of her friend group, they're moving on to cell phones and celebrity culture and memes and just all the rest of that, and she's not ready for that. And I have to say props to the author for not making those other kids bullies. Like, they invite her to come along with them on their outings and whatever it is they're doing, and Laura says no. And so, because my experience growing up is that kids were mean to me when we were at that level of what we were doing in life. And I have to give her huge props for not like vilifying these children for growing up just at the rate they were growing up. So Laura's having like an imaginary tea party with her stuffed animals. She takes a piece of paper and draws a Ouija board and has the thing, and she summons a ghost, Alexa, and she finds out that Alexa was like her younger childhood imaginary friend, and then she disappeared when she no longer needed her, but now she's back, and they kind of become best friends. Alexa accompanies Laura trick-or-treating, and because she's like a very traditional ghost, so they cover her in a sheet, and so the ghost goes as a ghost. It's cute. But one of the houses that she trick-or-treats at, she finds a girl who's like a couple years older, but who was a mentor to her when a few years prior to the story, and they had lost connection. She had switched schools, and they're like, oh my god, it's so great seeing you. I'm having some friends over, come in. And she kind of doesn't want to. Alexa pushes her to do it, and she sort of learns that like not everyone older or everyone is the same. Like she meets these kids and they're kind of into the same thing she is, and also just like spooky culture and true crime podcasts, and they're like, oh, have you heard about that ghost story? And she kind of just realizes like it's about finding your tribe, finding your people, finding what you're looking for, and that not everybody's the same. And she becomes friends with them, and the story kind of follows maybe through the end of the year, but you see her like going to the mall with these kids and maybe like learning about makeup and but still being into what she's into, but growing up at her own pace and with people that are like her. And Alexa, the ghost, you learn that she doesn't really remember what her life was like prior to her dying, and you get the idea from her outfit that she maybe is from the 60s. And she goes to school with Laura, and she's like, I'm gonna just float around the school, see what's up. And she goes to the library, scores old yearbooks, finds herself in the yearbook, and sees her last name, and she starts remembering what her life was like. And she remembers her friend group. And she stumbles upon one of her childhood friends, who's now a grandmother of one of the students at the school. And they reunite, and killed me. I have a friend who died a couple years ago, and that really just hit me. And they reunite and just talk about, you know, the old memories and what she remembers of her. And it's just really sweet. And Alexa comes to a point where like she can leave the ghost realm and she can move on to that next step in her life as well. And I found the whole thing just really kind of touching and sweet. I would have related to it as a kid. It got me in those feelings of how I was as a child, and my friend groups, and how they all kind of moved on without me, and just the ghost friend, and the whole thing. It got me. I had welled up. I don't know if I actually was like wasn't sobbing by the end, but I needed the tissue. So I mean, it got me. So the diversity here was really cool. So she's Asian, but it's never actually addressed. It's Asian because the author's it's not Asian because the author's Asian, but the author's Asian. The main characters are Asian, but I don't think they ever say it. And a bunch of her friend group, you can see from the illustrations, they're all sorts of races. Every kind of like all the races are represented, and also sexuality preferences are very lightly dealt with, where it's just an everyday thing and no one ever mentions it again. It's not the point of the story, because a school dance is coming up, and Laura's like, oh, I think I'm gonna ask so and so, but if they say no, I have all these options. And the illustration is a bunch of like Instagram photos of her different options, and they are very clearly, some are boys, some are girls. And I was like, and then never mentioned again. And so I thought that was really sweet, a really lighthearted way of including and making and normalizing the differences that people have in life. And there was something in the end, well, maybe go, because one of the illustrations in the beginning, when I was confused, is that when the ghost shows up, she kind of bum rushes Laura, and it looks like the beginning of that movie, that Ben Affleck, Sandra Bullock movie that I've never seen, but I remember when it came out, called Forces of Nature, and the cover is Sandra Bullock like almost like floating on top of Ben Affleck, and there's an illustration like that, and I was like, and this is at the beginning before we saw her possibly getting a date for the Séance, and I was like, were they about to kiss? It seemed like this, and I was like, I don't understand this in the context of the story. And granted, it still didn't. Like, is she bum rushing her? Like, I couldn't figure out what the illustration represented. I still don't really. But then after that happened, I was like, oh, maybe it was. I mean, maybe it probably wasn't, but I was like, oh, okay. But I liked all that. But yeah, no, I'd recommend this. I mean, if you like middle grade stuff, this is sweet. But especially if you have like a kid who's struggling with the kids around them moving on past things they were all into at some point, and they are still there, and the friends have moved on to other stuff. I think this would be a good book for that, of showing, you know, everybody grows up at their own time and their own pace, and that's okay. So I gave this one 4 stars. So the next book that I really enjoyed is Walking in My Joy in These Streets by Jenifer Lewis. And it's not quite a memoir, but it's memoir-esque. But it's not her whole life. It's sort of it's little essays. Some of them are about her childhood, but most of them are about more current phases of her life. It's COVID. A lot of it's COVID heavy, so if you don't want to read COVID, don't read this. I found it through Levy. I was kind of looking for an audiobook. I ran out of things I just wanted to read on my own. And I was going through, I was like, what does Levy have in audiobooks? And I saw this was there, and I was like, oh, because I don't know if y'all know Jenifer Lewis. I came to her through Blackish. She plays Grandma Ruby, but she's been around for ages. She plays one of Aunt Viv's in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air's sisters, but she's been in all sorts of things. I just came to her kind of late. But she has such a distinct voice, and does such a charisma in the way she reads her stories. I wrote some of the quotes down from the book. This particular one made me laugh. She's talking about in context to that when she's kind of just living her life day to day. She likes to wear robes, brightly colored robes, and occasionally she'll wear 2 of them. But she said about her robes, quote, basically I cocoon in them to contain the massiveness of my charisma, unquote. And I died. Because I've read some people are like, oh wow, she's got an ego. Yeah, she does, and she knows it. She talks about it. She's fully aware that she's got an ego, and she's got this massive charisma. But it's really, my only real issues with it almost were the title. I thought the story, because it's called Walking in My Joy, that the stories would be really joyful. And parts of the stories are joyful. But then they end sadly. It got to the point where you knew every year, okay, well, how's this one gonna end? And that's fine in and of themselves, but I kind of went into the book thinking that it was going to be this joyous book. Yeah, because there was one story where she talks about, I think it's Shangela, the drag queen, that before Shangela became a career as a drag queen, he was just a fan of Jenifer Lewis and met her at a stage door, and then they kind of became friends, and then he became her personal assistant, and he lived in her basement. And it's this great story, and I'm like, oh wow, that's cool. And then it ends with the Pulse nightclub shooting, and in Florida that targeted LGBT people. And I mean, she ends the chapter naming all these victims, and that's awesome, and that's good that she did that these people won't be forgotten. But it's like, whoa, tone shift. And a lot of her stories are like this. And it doesn't make the stories any less worthwhile. I just do feel that it's of note that this isn't quite a joyous book as maybe the cover and the title lends you to believe. I think it's more of her finding her joy in these situations. It is a bit fun of a name drop. She talks about her friendship with Brandy. But all of it, I really enjoyed it. I really liked it. I didn't know she has an actual memoir, and she mentions that in here. She's like, well, if you want to know more about that, just go read this. And I was like, oh. So that's on my TBR. I'll be reading that soon. I did this on audiobook, which I absolutely recommend just because her voice is there. Oh, she does, I don't know how this plays out in the physical format. It's probably just written, but she does spoken word poetry or singing in between some of her chapters, and I imagine it to be so much more impactful hearing it on audio than you would as a physical book. So I would definitely recommend the physical book, but the audio book. I'm sure the physical one's nice too, but I think you'd get more of an impact with her voice and her storytelling and all that. But she had started to write the book, and then she stopped, and I wrote down this quote too. Quote, I am, quote, not allowed to write this book until I became this book. And another quote kind of around the same time, quote, what right do I have to sit here and tell you to walk in your joy if I'm not doing it, end quote. And I think she had started writing the book and she wasn't really in a good place. And she does talk about her mental health and that she's on meds for that, and she needs that to really kind of like normalize and not be super out there. But I think she was in a bad place. She was writing a book with that title, and then she's like, you know what? She scrapped it and kind of like worked on herself and then wrote this book. And like I said, there are joyous bits into it. It's just, it always almost like, instead of having the moral at the end, it's like, here's the downer at the end. But I don't really think that makes the story or the book any less worthwhile, so I would still recommend it. I also give that one 4 stars. So the next book that's on my list that I read is Best Wishes, Warmest Regards, the story of Schitt's Creek, and Daniel and Eugene Levy wrote it. And if you're not familiar with the show, this is a show. It won a buttload of Emmys for its last season. I think it won every Emmy that it could have won. It's a show about a family. The show is called Schitt's Creek. The show is about a family who was very, very wealthy. They lose all their money. As a joke, the dad, Johnny Rose, the family of the Roses, Johnny Rose had bought a town as a joke gift for his son. They still actually own that town, so they moved to this sort of like very out in the boonies, very small, I kind of call it a crossroads town, like just 2 roads and everything's right there. And they moved to this town, and the show's sort of them, just their life in this town and becoming acclimating and with the community and the townspeople. And I consider it one of the best sitcoms I've ever seen in the terms of character development and story development, and I just haven't seen much better. But so the show is over. I think it's on, as of this moment, as of this recording, it seems to migrate to all the streaming services, but as of right now it's on Hulu. But I asked for this book for Christmas, and I finally got to reading it, because what I wanted to do, because the way it's set up, the beginning is a bunch of essays by the actors about their characters, and then them sort of talking about the making of the show, the costume people, the makeup people, the writing, the prep of like getting a show off the ground. So that stuff you can read, and then it becomes, it's not every episode, but every few episodes or so, and it'll be listed by episode. Season 1, episode 4, and then a couple of actors will talk about a scene that was important to them, and what that, or a fun story about that episode, and then that's really it. And then you might get another episode a couple episodes later, and it's a fun story or some insight. It's not every episode, it's not a deep thinking behind the scenes of every episode. But I wanted to, it's been maybe 2 years since I watched the show, so I really wanted to rewatch it and kind of go through the episodes as I hit the episodes. So it took me maybe 2 months to get through it, month and a half, as I did the rewatch. But it's a really quick read, because Dan and Eugene talk about this being like a gift for the fans. And it's so full of fan art, and they are so wonderful about crediting where they got every single piece of their fan art. And also some of it, I think they may have commissioned some fan art for their chapter titles, but like you have like the fun map of Schitt's Creek. They have a fun map of Alexis, their daughter. She's always like, oh, that time I was in Ibiza with so-and-so, and they did a map of all the places Alexis has been. There's also a ton of behind the scenes photos. There's some original script pages that maybe like the end result changed. It's a really sweet, fun book. And I think this is definitely gift worthy for if you know a Schitt's Creek person, a Schitt's Creek fan in your life. Like I was David for Halloween last year. So I think, I think this is a great gift. The only reason I'm giving this 4 stars, is because a lot of the information isn't new. Like if you were a big fan, you've probably seen some of these photos before, you've probably read a lot about this before, and a lot of the information isn't brand new. but I still was delighted by it. It was like visiting an old friend. The pictures are sweet. I'm glad to have them so you don't have to like search for them on the internet or something. But I really enjoyed this. It was really cool. And there are some new things that I learned about it. And so I really enjoyed it. But 4 stars. And I would say very gift worthy. It's a nice like hefty coffee table thing. So now I'm going to just talk about the books that I was just like, okay, that was fine. It was fine. But I want to talk about Till Death Do Us Part by Dickson Carr. I got this as an ARC from Poisoned Pen Press, so thank you, Poisoned Pen Press, for this book. It's originally published in 1944. It's been republished by the British Library Crime Classics series, and it's deemed important because of its locked room mystery. It's considered one of the best locked room stories. You know, locked rooms, where something happens inside of a locked space. So there's very like, either no one else is in the room but the dead body, and how could that have happened? Because all the windows and doors are locked. And this is considered to be one of the better of those. So that this is actually a part of a series, not just the British Crime Classic series, but I mean, this book in itself, it was part of a series called, with the main detective's name is Dr. Gideon Fell. It's the 15th in that series, but Dr. Gideon Fell is barely in it. He doesn't show up till halfway through, so I think this is very different, or I'm assuming it's very different from the other ones in that series. I would be curious to go back and read the other ones. So the author, Dickson Carr, is actually American born, but lived in England for years, and he found a great affinity with like that British manor country house murder, and so a lot of his books are kind of lumped into British Golden Age mysteries. But the story is Dick Markham. He's our lead main character. He's a playwright, I believe, and he's kind of hanging out in this English countryside place. And pre-story, he met this woman, Leslie. She's sort of, in the last couple years, new to the village. Everyone thinks she's sort of mysterious. They don't really know a lot about her because she kind of just showed up by herself. She's super pretty, lovely. They're in love. They get engaged like the night before the story starts. They go to the village fete, and it's like a fundraiser for something. There is a fortune teller with the ball and everything, and she goes talks to him, but we only see it from the outside, from far away. And you can tell that he tells her something, and she gets very upset about it. And she leaves, and Dick's like, "What happened, Leslie? Are you okay?" And she's like, no, it was fine. It was fine. He just told me, I'm going to get a letter. She's clearly lying. And Dick goes to talk to him because he's like, I'm going to stick up for my lady. And while this is happening, there is like a shooting range as part of this fete. And at some point, Leslie had a gun in her hand, accidentally it goes off, shoots the fortune teller in the butt. And it's like, did she try to shoot him? Was it really an accident? That's part of it. And then later that night, so everybody brings this guy to his house. And Dick is called to go over that the fortune teller man wants to tell him something. And he says, "Look, I'm not really a fortune teller, but I'm really this detective, and I was just coming to town to lay low, to have a nice like vacay, and I got roped into doing this. I thought it would be fun." He's like, "But really, Leslie is a serial husband killer by poison." And he tells him this whole story about how these men are poisoned in what looks like suicide in a locked room, and that they suspect her, but they can't prove it. And he's like, "Would you please help me set up a situation where we can catch her and do it?" And so he's just like, "What are you telling me? Why are you, my fiance is not a serial poisoner." He's telling all these things, and so what's interesting is that because you're getting it from this fiance's point of view, do I trust this woman? I love this woman. Can I trust her? Of course I trust her. It's a lot of that doubt that happens. But he agrees that he will help set the situation up so they can catch her or not catch her, because if she didn't do it, it's not going to happen. And then that night, the night of that conversation, the setup is supposed to happen the next night. The night of when he's having that conversation, the next morning, this fortune teller slash cop person is found dead in the exact same way all of these husband people have been killed, in a locked room situation. But it's like, wait, he's not marrying Leslie. And it becomes this, you know, him trying to solve, I guess he's just trying to figure out whether or not he can trust his woman. And midway through the story, Dr. Gideon Fell finally shows up. And I'm going to say the first half of the story is great. The setup, how it happens, the premise of whether or not you can trust this woman, the whole locked room of it, this whole like presentation that she's been killing men, like all of that. I was fully prepared to give this 5 stars. I was so excited by this, I thought it was great. And then the second half, Dr. Gideon Fell shows up, and then it just becomes super repetitive over and over and over again. Because he wasn't there for it, so he's just like, well, tell me what happened. We saw what happened, because we were with Dick when it happened. And Dick sort of kind of believes he witnessed it. And so he's like, well, Dick, what happened? So he tells it. We already witnessed this, so now we're hearing it again. And then Dick's already kind of talked to people, and then he starts talking to people, tell me what happened. So they're saying it again, even though we've already heard it. And it just becomes very repetitive. And at some point, Dick's just like, I've told you this already. Like, because he keeps asking Dick over and over again, what happened? What happened? What did you see? And it's clearly like, oh, he's getting something new each time he tells it, and he's putting it together. But as a reader, it gets very repetitive. And for being that the first half was such a like cool, like flew through the first half, and then it just kind of grinded to a halt in the second half. I thought the resolution was good, a little convoluted. I'm not sure we could have come to it on our own. But I'm gonna average it out to like 3 stars. The first half is 5 stars, the second half is 2 stars. My husband, I was fussing about it to my husband. He's like, well, why do you keep reading it? And I'm like, well, because the first half is so good. Like, I have to know how this ends now. But so do with that what you will. As a locked room murder mystery, I get why this was important or cool or better than everybody else, because it was pretty cool. It just, I wish maybe it was formatted or presented in a different way. So my next book I'm going to talk about is How Y'all Doing by Leslie Jordan. How Y'all Doing? Misadventures and Mischief from a Life Well Lived. And I don't know if y'all know who Leslie Jordan is, but he's a comedic actor. Apparently he's done one-man shows, theater shows, but he came to my knowledge from Will and Grace, even like the original one of Will and Grace. He was Karen's nemesis. He was Karen's nemesis. And most recently, he was in this show on Fox called The Cool Kids, which is about like a bunch of older people living in a really cool like senior living community with David Allen Greer, Martin Mull, and Vicki Lawrence. I watched that show. I was delighted by it. Really sad it didn't continue. But basically, this book came out of during COVID. He started just posting. He made an Instagram account because of The Cool Kids. Like, they made him make one, the PR people, the marketing people. And then during COVID, he started posting all sorts of just his life and sort of he's got that southern drawl, how y'all doing? And you'll know him if you hear him talk. And he'd post things about his sticker collection or doing dances and whatever, and his Instagram just like blew up. And so all of a sudden, he, in the golden years of his life, he's sort of super famous now, or like viral famous in a way that he never expected. And this is sort of just like little essays on portions of his life. He does name drop, but only ever for good. He doesn't name drop for people he doesn't like. And some of his stories are really sweet. He has a really lovely story about Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds, and it's adorable and sweet. My only real issue with this is that he doesn't go deep. He's only like he talks about that he has addiction issues, but he never really talks about the addiction issues. He never talks about like when he hit rock bottom. He doesn't talk about that. He mentions it like, oh, I went and did this because I hit rock bottom, but he never talks about what those experiences are. And like those are the things I would want to know more about. Like, don't tease that and then not talk about it, you know? But if you like Leslie Jordan and you like his work, I would give this a listen. He's kind of like where I said Jenifer Lewis. He's got a very distinctive voice. He's such a personality. And he's got really interesting, fun stories to tell about fashion shows he was in and his crush on Dylan McDermott. And just, he's got fun little stories in here. And some of them are sadder than others. His dad died when he was really young. He's gay, how his mom treated, how his relationship with his mom because of that was/is. So there's like deeper stuff in here. I just feel like he could have gone deeper. But so I'm just giving this also 3.75 stars. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. It's nonfiction, which is my first nonfiction of his that I read, and a bunch of essays. It's kind of like, well, I listened to this on audio, and it's presented as reviews of experiences of life. Like, he talked about prior to becoming an author, and he was, that he wrote book reviews for Booklist maybe, but he wrote book reviews for a living. And you could only like write the book review in a certain amount of words, and he got decently good at writing reviews. And just like the concept reviews, or movie reviews in restaurants and hotels, and where did that come from? And so this book was sort of, reviewing his experiences in life. And it was a little more serious than I expected. You do have some light ones where he reviews Dr. Pepper. Is it Dr. Pepper? That's his thing? He reviews his Dr. Pepper. Or Diet Coke. Whatever. He has a soda that he's obsessed with. He reviews it. He reviews the Coney Island hot dog eating contest. He reviews Piggly Wiggly. And it becomes more than that. It's never just like Piggly Wiggly's a grocery store with aisles. Like, and it's a good shopping experience. He talks about kind of the history of supermarkets, and his grandfather worked at a supermarket that eventually kind of got put out of business by Piggly Wiggly, and the guy who owned Piggly Wiggly, he gives sort of like his autobiography, and that he was a really interesting fellow, a little bit Nazi, that he actually tried to have self-checkouts like way back in the day, but the technology didn't work. And just, they have these stories that are not just about the thing. It's always about sort of something else. In the beginning, because the Anthropocene is sort of like the Jurassic period is the dinosaur period. The Anthropocene is the human period. Once we go extinct, it'll become something else. Who's gonna name it? Don't know, because we're all dead. But the Anthropocene is sort of our period. And so he's reviewing human existence, reviewing sunsets, and the Anthropocene in and of itself. He had a couple quotes in here that I really liked. One, he was talking about grief. Quote, "But for me at least, grief is a series of tightly packed circles that fade over many years like ink exposed to light." I thought that was really lovely. And he was talking about how, this next quote, he was talking about how people can say something offensive and then you go, it's just a joke. Don't be offended, it's just a joke. In this quote, "It's so easy to take refuge in the just of just kidding," end quote. And I thought that was great. I thought that was so insightful and so simple. He talks about bands, starts with bands, the Mountain Goats, which I didn't know existed until my friend Joe posts about it all the time in his Instagram stories, and I'm like, oh, Joe, John Green likes the Mountain Goats. But John Green has a lot of anxieties, and he has mental health struggles, and he talks a lot about that, and how COVID really spiked his anxieties and whatnot. So it does talk about COVID. If you don't want to hear about COVID, maybe don't go into this. But I enjoyed it enough. He does talk about sports and soccer, football. He's a big footballer. I enjoyed this. I liked it. I think it could be something you go to and from. It's not something you have to audiobook. I chose to audiobook it, but I think it would be the same experience either way. But it could be something you pick up, read a portion, put it down. It doesn't have a a huge follow through kind of thing. You could do it like a short story collection. But I'm giving this one 3.75 stars. So the next book I'm going to talk about is A Place in the World, Finding the Meaning of Home by Frances Mays. I also audiobooked this. So Frances Mays wrote Under the Tuscan Sun and has a bunch of travelogue books. I've never read Under the Tuscan Sun nor have seen it, so I could not have told you who Frances Mays was. I barely knew what this was about going in. One of my local bookstores posted about it on their Instagram when it dropped, saying like, oh, good friend of the bookstore, just released a new book. And they said something like, oh, it's interesting or whatever. And I went, oh, let me see if it's on audio. Went and listened to it, had kind of almost no idea going in. I'm not sure I could have physically read it. So like, I liked it. This is a weird confuzzle of a book for me, because I liked it. But there's like a pretentiousness to this book. And I don't know if that's how she always writes, or I get the idea that she was born with a decent level of comfort. She had a very nice house growing up, and every place she has ever lived is very nice. And she does acknowledge that privilege to some extent, but it's like, girl, like just at some house she had glass walls, like those rich houses that you always see with the fully glass walls. You can see the trees and whatever. And this farmhouse her husband bought in South Carolina, and it's this gorgeous, and she's talking about this garden that she's reviving, and I'm just like, who has this time? And she, Under the Tuscan Sun, she's got a villa in Italy they go to visit like a few times a year. It's sort of insane. But listening to it on audio, the woman, she doesn't read it herself, the woman that reads it, the way she reads it, I got more of a Rose vibes. If you've watched Schitt's Creek, Catherine O'Hara plays the character very like pretentious and highfalutin, and she always uses big words, and she says the words in a very specific, like syllables are enunciated that wouldn't be normally. And that's, so if you say More Roses at 100, this was at maybe like 20% of that. So I'm not saying it's like that, but I kind of got a delight from like listening to the way she would say cracked. She'd be like, it cracked, or I don't know. It was just, it was an interesting listen. And it's very, I was like, why is it written like this? And I mentioned it to a friend of mine, and she's like, oh, because it's very florid. It's just so many words and very pretty words to describe things. And a friend of mine said, she's like, oh, that's how travelogues are. I'm like, oh, okay. So maybe that's the norm. And then I find out that Frances Mays, like, she's also a poet. That's what she went to school for. I'm like, oh, that makes sense. That vibes. I found there was a quote, there's a few quotes in it that I liked. This quote I thought represented the book as a whole and the way it's written. The blue dome of sky resembles an inverted glazed cobalt china teacup. That is how she described the sky. But it's really just finding the meaning of home. She talks about just various places she lived and her experiences living there. And I mean, that's really it. And some of this, I mean, the stories are really lovely. Like, she has really lovely stories, and they're really well described. So I enjoyed it, but I just kept going, God, you're a pretentious lady. But I did still enjoy it. There was a weird bit. It's not weird. It's not weird in the story itself. She talks about the house in Italy and cooking in Italy. And that everyone who's from Italy cooks way easier than we cook in America. They don't have all our gadgets, and they don't have all our things, and it's so much easier to have like a dinner party just immediately. Hey, y'all want to come over tonight? And just like you don't have to spend 18 hours preparing for the dinner party. And they don't use measurements there. It's all like, you don't use tablespoons, teaspoons, blah, blah, blah. And she talks about that she wrote a cookbook about the food that she liked and started to make since she lived in Italy. Found that at the library, checked that out, And then it's weird because she gives measurements for every stinking thing. And like for someone who says Italy doesn't use measurements, she's all for using measurements in her Italy cookbook. Weird. But she talks about like her childhood home, the home she lives in now, the home in Italy. She talks about like places maybe she only lived for a month. After her divorce, she moved to Mexico for a month just to like get away and reset. And she talks about what that was like. And she lived in various like Airbnbs for like, you know, they would visit a different village and they would stay there for a month, or different in Turkey at some point, I think. And just talking about just what home's like and the bits about gardening, because I would love to garden. I think I'd be terrible at it, but I love to go to a botanical garden. And she talks about gardening and plants and flowers and how her research into like reconstructing this garden of where she lived. And it's a really sweet book of what home is to her, but that's not going to be what home is for everybody. But so take it all with a grain of salt. I liked it, but I was like, this reads, I have a lot of money, you know, but I still give this one 3.75 stars. So my next book was also an audiobook, Meet Me by the Fountain by Alexandra Lange, and it's an inside history of the mall. I audiobooked this as well, and I could have never physically read this. I would have stopped so fast, because this is like standard nonfiction. It's like, you know, I went and did a thing, and here's what the thing, you know, like what my interview people said, and here's the history. And I mean, it's not interesting. I'm giving it like 3.5 stars, but it's not, I enjoyed it. I'm just saying, like, it's not like Eric Larson fictionalized a mall history, you know, it's a history of the mall. And I was looking up Alexandra Lange, the author, because I was wondering, it doesn't really say what her qualifications are for this. And I think she must have studied architecture or architectural studies, history of architecture when she was in school, because that's all her books are about that sort of thing. And this was really interesting about like how malls came to be and why the outsides are so boring but the insides are really interesting, and also the concept of whether or not malls are public or private, because malls are set up to sort of be like their own towns. Like she talks about this idea that all civilizations since the beginning of time need like a town center, need a place for people to meet up. And urban cultures have that with like downtowns and all that, but when suburbia got invented post World War II and everyone got all these grants and the interstate system came to be, that sort of town center meeting space went away, and the mall filled that space, and where people could go and meet up because you didn't have like a town center. And that became the town center, but it's still privately owned. And because it gets into like whether or not protests can be held at a mall, where you could hold a protest in a public space, they want you to think it's a public space, but it's not a public space, and whether or not you have the right for that. And like they have their own security, and people who are afraid of going into more of an urban setting because they're afraid they might get robbed or something, it's like a fake city where you know everything's going to be clean and pristine and safe. And I thought that aspect of this was very interesting, because she does get into also like racial and how malls are to different races and all that sort of thing. And sort of how, and of course she talks about the death of the mall and a little bit about how that's a misnomer. The people have been saying the mall's been dying since the 80s, and clearly that hasn't been the case. It just has to be reinvented. And some malls are doing better than others. Like I know in my neck of the woods, we have 3 malls. One's like in, you know, a 15-mile radius or whatever. We have one that's kind of legitimately dead. One that's okay, and one that is flourishing. Like, this mall isn't dying anytime soon. And it's very much just sort of like, how do you keep it up, and what neighborhoods they're in, and just sort of, they said malls have to be reinvented every 10 years. There's this mall in Texas they were talking about that's doing very well, has always done very well. But they have guidelines for all these stores, very specific guidelines that every store has to follow. And it's sort of like, you have to design your store that revamping it every 5 or 10 years can be really easy to do. So it never gets dated, it always stays fresh, and that's how you keep your mall alive. And sort of like where malls are going. And they talked about the original guy who designed the mall really wanted the mall to be like within the same, maybe like not so much the parking lot, but kind of in that same area you could have apartments and schools, and like kind of make it its own city and it kind of center itself. And he got investments for that, but then once the mall was up, all the investors kind of were like, nah, this is fine. And they're saying that's sort of what the mall is becoming, is that people who are filling the dead malls are filling it with maybe like city centers, or like, you know, town halls and the post office, and maybe you might have a library in an old mall. And some malls are becoming apartment spaces. But they were talking about immigrants are really taking hold of malls and kind of doing like food courts, but like making food halls and really kind of putting their businesses in it. And she also talks about how malls are flourishing outside of America. Like, they're doing super well outside of America. So we can't really say, oh, it's Amazon or it's the internet. People want to, because she's like, people want to go hang out. And to go be seen in public. And it's doing very well. I Googled it. In this book, I constantly felt myself Googling. She'd talk about a mall, and I'd be like, I was wondering if in the physical book they would have photographs, but I was constantly going, what does this mall look like? What did this mall look like? But I thought it was really interesting. I learned a lot. I think I can only get through it audio-wise. I also kept singing Taylor Swift's August in my head, the Meet Me by the Mall, over and over again. But I really enjoyed it. Also, I'm a kid who, like, I kind of forgot that I was like this, and then it reminded me that, like, I generally don't love malls. Like, here in my home, like, as a kid, I hated going to the mall. It was always a hassle for my mom to bring me to the mall. I still, like, if I can avoid the mall, I do. I hit up the mall once or twice a year. But I loved when we would go on vacation, going to malls that were not my own. I kind of loved that, and I'm not even really sure why. And this brought that memory back, and that made me happy. But yeah, so 3.5 stars. So the last book that I finished reading is The Pigeon Will Ride the Roller Coaster by Willems. It's a picture book for littles, and I love the Pigeon books. I'm a big fan of these, big fan of a lot of Willems' work. And I think I was aware it came out, but I was in Target, saw it, picked it up literally in Target, and then read it, put it back. I'm counting it. But the Pigeon, he's always sort of talking to like the audience, like to his readers, and kind of like asking them stuff, and you're kind of like, the kids are supposed to respond back when they read it. And this one's particularly about, he's going to an amusement park, he wants to ride a roller coaster, but he's kind of nervous. And he's building himself up to be okay with riding this roller coaster. And then he finally rides the roller coaster, and it's over. That's generally the thing. I was just a little let down by it, because I thought I was let down by the end. I won't say what it is. I mean, I know it's a kid's book. I won't say what it is, but I thought the ending could have been better. So I'm also giving this 3.5 stars. I mean, I love the illustrations. His illustrations are so good. They're just simple, like kind of really simplistic drawings, but he's able to show so much expression with just like tilts of eyebrows and the eyeball direction. And so I'm always a big fan of his illustrative work. It's just, I thought the ending of the story, I would have done something different if I had written it. So 3.5 stars. The book that I DNF, and I said in my intro video, I have the hardest time DNFing, but I DNF'd Skunk and Badger by Amy Timberlake. Pictures by John Klassen, who does a lot of the Shark Stole My Hat, or I don't know. He's got a few picture books that I actually do find delightful. I can't remember how I stumbled upon this on Goodreads or something, and I was like, oh, that looks really cute, and I got it from Levy, and I got just stuck in it really fast. It's about Skunk and Badger. Badger lives in a townhouse that his aunt lent him. She's like, you can live here while I do something else. And he's kind of remodeled it. He's a rock scientist. He studies rocks, and he's trying to like earn a living with rocks. And he makes a whole rock room, and he's got his little like table set up for his rocks. And then all of a sudden, Skunk shows up, and Badger is very like, this is borderline Odd Couple situation going on here with Oscar and Felix. Skunk shows up, and he thinks he's like a snake oil salesman, and he kind of keeps shutting him out. And then Skunk's like, no, but Aunt said I could live with you. And he's like, what? And then he realizes he had letters from the aunt that he never opened, and so he's kind of mean to the Skunk. The Skunk's trying so hard to be nice, and he is a jerk to Skunk. And Skunk keeps trying to get involved, and it's cute. I liked it. I would say maybe like every chapter this would be something to read to your kids at night. Also, it's not like a picture book. I know it's illustrations, but they're kind of at the beginning of each chapter. So this would be perfectly great for like a 7-year-old, 8-year-old. But it got to a point where Badger is examining his rocks, and it got very scientific in a way that I personally don't enjoy. I'm not a science kid. It was always the subject I struggled the most with in school, and I collected rocks as a kid. But this, I was just like, I kept getting stuck in it, and I went back, and I was like, you know what? I'm not gonna read it anymore. And it felt like the weight of the world got lifted off my shoulders. It's like I should DNF more often. But I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it just wasn't for me. So I would not recommend it. You know, I think it's fine. I think if you have a kid who's maybe really into rocks and science, this would be cool. But just not for me. And then, and my pending DNF is the second in the steeped tea. A Magic Steeped in Poison was the first book, but A Venom, Dark and Sweet is the second. I got so stuck in it. I got maybe a third of the way through it, and it took me forever just to do that. And I found it very frustrating, and I just really wanted to move on to something else. I was like, well, we'll just put it down and go back to it another day. That day hasn't come yet. I haven't fully decided that day will never come, but it's just not right now. I struggled with the first one a lot. The pacing is weird. I struggled getting to know the characters. The main character, her main characteristic trait is that she wants to make her sister better. Like, she's got no personality. And the second book the first story is told completely from her point of view. The second book just adds a second point of view out of nowhere, and it's weird because the book picks up pretty much immediately after the first book ends, so to just throw a second point of view character in there for no reason at all. And it's not that I'm not enjoying his point of view, it just seems weird. Like, we should have always had his point of view then. And it's just, I read the first one really recently, and I've already forgotten who half these characters are, because none of them really stuck with me. And she's doing things like they're on this journey to do something, which I couldn't even remember, even though that was how the book ended, and I'm like, what is happening? But they're going on this journey to find someone, and they come across this army who's coming after them. And in the story, the tea is magical, and you can drink tea and kind of like throw yourself into people, or it'll make you more braver, or it'll make you stronger, or make you kind of like, you can manipulate people with your mind. It's all sorts of things. I talk about it in my August wrap-up of the first book. But there's a bit where these two people that she's with, who are trained sort of warriors, they're like, we're gonna go deal with these soldiers, you take you and these other people on the horses and hide in the woods. And she's like, but I have to help them. So she drinks a tea, and I think she makes them drink the tea so she can kind of go with them mentally to help them, which we see her do that, but we never actually see her help them. She's just sort of with them, and she's like, I can feel their movements. But I'm like, what are you doing to help these people? Like, what is the point of any of this? And that's around the point that I stopped. I may go back, because I kind of want to know how it ends, but right now we've pressed pause on that one. So that is my September wrap-up. Let me know if you've read any of these, if your thoughts differ from mine, or if you agree with me. Let me know. Please like and subscribe and press notify, all the things. And I'll see you next time. Bye.